Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming here tonight. Let me start with some disclaimers. First of all, I'm not an academic. I do not speak or read Arabic, and I certainly don't have the skills of a diplomat. My observations tonight are based on a deep set of business engagements in the region, and it's seen me as a frequent visitor to all the countries of the Arab Peninsula over the last 8 years. I spent most of the last week in the Emirates and Saudi. Those 8 years have been a period. Sorry, can you hear me? I just want to make sure you can hear. Right, good. I was hoping you couldn't hear, Patrick. The 8 years have been that I've been going there have been a period of considerable turmoil and change. And the structure of my talk tonight is to take you on a quick tour of the peninsula. Then I want to talk about 5 challenges that are common to the countries of the peninsula but manifest themselves in different ways. And then I want to finally touch on Australia's changing relationship with the region and what the opportunities and risks are for Australia and how it should go about them. I apologise that I kind of for reading this, but it is such a careful area, so I don't normally like reading speeches, but it's probably the best thing to do. I also shoved my hand in a bicycle this afternoon, which allows me an attempt at a joke, which I thought I ought to give you before I went any further. Doing business in the Middle East is very different. And there was once a meeting in an unnamed country where a chap came in and he had stitches all round his wrist. And everyone got up and said, "Congratulations, we see you've won your appeal." So I thought that's what I was trying to at the end of my talk, I hope you will have collected something from the ramblings of a businessman rather than the meal you're normally served of finely honed observations of academics and the nuanced approaches of diplomats. Dragoman's work in the Middle East has been to advise quite a few companies, Australian and American, on investing in the region. We've worked with them on dealing with some very difficult issues, sometimes that they were ones that they had before we took them there, none that we caused. We've helped new companies go into the region, which is, I think, very exciting. After all, a dragoman is an Ottoman word meaning guide or an interpreter, and that's what I seek to do during the daytime. Let me start my tour with a few observations about each country. So I'm dealing with the countries on the Arab Peninsula. There you are. Saudi Arabia, as you will see from, is that statistical thing being handed out?
It's just sitting at the back.
Right, there's a little set of statistics that you might like to refer to. It is double the size of the economy of any other country in the region on the peninsula. And for somebody who was trained as a political scientist, it's a place of constant fascination. It's the only really serious absolute monarchy left in the world. I mean, there are lots of monarchies, but this is a big country. It's a serious country. It's the only Arab country in the G20, and it's globally significant on quite a few counts. First of all, obviously, it produces about 13% of the world's oil. Secondly, it has the greatest swing capacity to increase or decrease its oil production, turning on the tap. And that's an economic and political tool that it's been flexing with considerable effect in the last 2 years. It houses 2 of the principal sites of Islam, Mecca and Medina, the home of the Prophet, and the centre from which he started his Islamic revolution. These cities contain sites that are central to all strains of Islam, venerated by Shia and Sunni alike. Saudi Arabia has a tourism industry like no other. It's based on Muslims coming to exercise their duties to visit Mecca at least once in their life, and many who come annually to the Hajj. Over 8 million a year currently, and this has been a source of enormous revenue for these lands since the 800s. The Deputy Crown Prince, who was referred to in the introduction, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has claimed by 2030 he wants to have that number at 30 million a year. Saudi Arabia seeks to dominate politics and policies of the region. Its main rival is Iran. There'll be more on Iran later. They are currently the undisputed leader of the Arab world. It's a role in some ways they've taken over from Egypt in its far more weakened condition. Economically, they're the most significant country in the region, with Iran a growing rival, and Turkey a highly significant, but in many ways a country that focuses elsewhere. The seniority of the king among the Arab leadership on the peninsula is recognised and respected. I'll come down briefly to Kuwait, the second one, top right. It's somewhat unique in the kind that it's got, from a business perspective, it's got this highly dysfunctional democracy. It's kind of semi-elected, and the cabinet is appointed by the ruling family. And when they're grilled in question time, he promptly calls an election. And it has an electoral system that makes the Tasmanian one look easy. And the ruler appoints all the key ministers normally from his relatives. It's a country that's been plagued by an inability to take major decisions and corruption. It's also the country on the peninsula that has perhaps most successfully diversified its income by using a lot of the surpluses from oil production. It's arguably the second or third biggest oil producer on the peninsula, to build a global portfolio of investments, and that's helped reduce its exposure. Alarmingly, the rich Kuwaiti families invest elsewhere other than in Kuwait. Kuwaiti funds are behind many of the UAE's projects, for example, but they go much further afield. One of the merchant families there that I got to know quite well, they own every Subway concession, the sandwich shops, rather kind of sweet bread thing, every Subway concession in the M25. But it's always a worrying sign when the rich of the country don't want their money there. It's the ring road around London. M20. Bahrain is the next country we come to. It's the island kingdom connected to Saudi Arabia's oil-rich eastern province by a causeway. It's got very limited resources of its own, and it's largely a client state of the Saudis. And it's sustained by receiving their oil, refining it. It also acts as a slightly more liberal centre for life than Saudi. There's alcohol and entertainment. There's cinemas, which there aren't in Saudi Arabia. And the place is a refuge for expats and Saudis alike who cross the causeway on Thursday, which is the beginning of the Arab weekend, and many of them making it back in not quite so wholesome a condition on Saturday night. There are frequently gaps in the causeway where people have taken the shortcut. It was a prosperous banking centre, and the Saudis set it up to be a kind of banking centre, arguably roughly analogous to their kind of setting up a Hong Kong to China. But that really fell apart quite recently when the demonstrations in 2011, at the beginning of the Arab Spring. Bahrain's ruled by, it has a Shia majority population, but a Sunni king who has ruled rather ruthlessly and was particularly heavy-handed in dealing with those demonstrations. The Saudis sent in the army, the UAE sent in police, and they're still there. And that rather deterred some of the investment centre that it had been. It's a festering sore and an unresolved issue, and it's a very interesting barometer to looking at the region and how subtly or how harshly the politics of Bahrain are being dealt with. Qatar is surely one of the oddest countries in the world. It's in a way, I think of it as the mouse that roared. Some of you may remember that film. There are only 300,000 Qataris living in a country of 3 million people. It's the wealthiest country on earth by per capita income. And that's largely because of the development of massive oil and gas resources. The Qatari royal family, the Atanis, have been very aggressive and at times imaginative in using their wealth to project themselves and their country. The most public face of this is Al Jazeera, the network which does it in Arabic and English and quite a few other languages. And it's provided Qatar with a voice. Tiny Qatar has used its leverage and its cash to get all sorts of positions around the world. It's not so long ago that they suddenly had the Qatari ambassador to the UN elected as president of the General Assembly for a year's term. They won, in controversial circumstances, one might say, the right to host the Football World Cup. There are many Caribbean islands who have been the beneficiary of Qatari generosity. And it's got a huge program of trophy investments around the world. And the Shard in London, and I think they're now the owners of Harrods. It also seeks to be a player in disputes. I mean, it sent a small group of fighters to Libya to help get rid of Colonel Gaddafi. And it provides centres for debates and discussions. And it has this kind of controversial role. It's trying to produce peace on one side while funding terrorists on the other. Anyway, that's probably it. Now, the UAE is really the second most important country on the peninsula. It was formed 40 years ago by the Federation of the Trucial States. And the most significant of the emirates is Abu Dhabi. That emirate has oil wealth and is the political and military centre of the UAE. Dubai was established as a place rather akin to being the Singapore of the Arab world. It hasn't got oil, as the other emirates has, but it's exploited its position as a trading hub through its seaport and the airport, which is the busiest in the world now. And it's done that through the brilliance of the operation of Emirates Airline. It's a trading centre, and it's a place for large property plays. From a business perspective, it's seen as a place where it's easier to do business than Saudi, certainly, for example, but it has a mixed reputation. To some, it's a money laundry, particularly for Russia, and it's a place where people buy properties to hedge their investments against regime change or inclement weather at home, and to provide themselves with a bolt hole. And in some ways, it's been effectively the financial capital of Iran for the last 10 years. And will be a major beneficiary, I believe, of Iran coming back on stream. And it provides a similar function for the rich of Pakistan and many of the other significant countries of the region. It's a global hub, Dubai, and it's in a way that you have Riyadh, which is the capital of a much bigger country, but Dubai is in a way a much more significant city to the rest of the world. We advise a company that is seeking to do business throughout Africa and has operations all through Africa that it should make its African headquarters in Dubai, because that may seem odd, but there are more direct flights to African cities from Dubai than there are from anywhere in Africa. The last two countries I want to touch on before coming back to some of the issues that affect the whole region, first Oman. It's been under the constant and relatively benign rule from Sultan Qaboos, somebody can correct me on that, since he did away with his father and came to the throne in June 1970 in a coup orchestrated by the British. It's a country that's distinct on several scores. It enjoys a good relationship with Iran, certainly a distinction to the UAE and Saudi, and generally peaceful relations with its neighbours. It's less wealthy than all the other countries on the peninsula except Yemen. And it's notable for a country where a much larger percentage of its population work, rather than using guest workers. Yemen, of course, is in a hideous condition. It's been wrecked by civil war for most of the last 30 years, and it's by far the poorest country on the peninsula. It's the centre for AQAP, Al-Qaeda on the Arab Peninsula, which is regarded as the most pernicious Al-Qaeda franchise in the world. Saudi Arabia has traditionally sought to ensure that Yemen maintains a weak but stable government of figures answerable to them. The only leader on the Arabian Peninsula to fall in the Arab Spring was the dictator of Yemen. The corrupt and brittle dictatorship was replaced by his deputy, who was arguably equally corrupt, but both having been backed heavily by the Saudis. But however, the Houthi, a sympathetic Shia group within Yemen, upset the equilibrium by pushing their suit and taking territory beyond their traditional areas. That balance was shattered with Sana'a, the capital, falling to Houthi and a number of other cities. There's much more that can be said about Yemen, but I want to use Yemen and the response of the region to its problem as the first of the 5 issues that I want that are kind of pan the pan-peninsula issues. Most of the crisis occurred in the second half of 2014 when King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was ailing. He died in January last year. The Saudis did little to intervene in the way they had to try and maintain this balance, and it got completely out of control. When King Salman succeeded his half-brother Abdullah, he appointed his 30-year-old son as defence minister and chairman of a cabinet committee that runs all the economic and social portfolios of the government. The young Prince Mohammed got together with the highly effective de facto ruler of the UAE, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of Abu Dhabi, and led an invasion of Yemen over a year ago, which has had very mixed results but profound long-term consequences. The Saudis and the Emiratis believe that the Iranians were arming the Houthi and seeking a foothold of influence on the peninsula. The evidence would suggest the Houthis did it all pretty much by themselves, but as they became more successful, the Iranians sought to help them. So one attracted the other. The most effective part of the military operation against the Houthi was led by the UAE Special Forces, which is, interestingly enough, under the command of an Australian former Major General Mike Hindmarsh, with the Saudis providing something that they're very keen on, large aerial bombardments. The results, as I said, are mixed. The Houthis had considerable effect in taking villages and Saudi settlements in southern Saudi Arabia, much to the embarrassment and distress of the Saudis, who found that their special forces were, in the terms of one very senior Riyadh-based diplomat, not so special. The Saudis and the Emiratis cannot effectively take control of Yemen and have now sued for peace and they declared themselves victorious and are suing for peace. And they're really trying to re-establish the uneasy stalemate that will restore a dysfunctional country to an equilibrium between its different factions. The massive loss of life, the cost of the destruction of the infrastructure and social fabric will lead to further entrenched hatreds and inspire extremists for many generations to come. Several other quick points about the Yemen incursion, which are illustrative of the region. The US and UK were informed just before the invasion took place. Their intelligence and munitions have been absolutely essential to the prosecution of the Saudi UAE cause, albeit reluctantly provided. The invasion was probably the single largest unilateral act in recent times by GCC countries, and may signal a pattern of more activity by the Saudis and the UAE acting together in regional disputes. The cost to both Saudi and the UAE has been massive, with the bill in the order of at least 30 billion. The Saudis have had a nasty shock seeing the weakness of both their ground forces and their borders. And third, it's been a high-risk test for Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and I'll abbreviate him to MBS from now on. But by and large, it has been a popular war. And what is striking, having been there quite a few times, is the totally different attitude, cultural attitude to the war dead. They're hailed as heroes, as martyrs. Several people who, won't quote him, but a very senior person in the UAE who has been very instrumental in the thing would go with the Crown Prince to see the families, and they'd be thanked for the opportunity to have given their son to the cause. It's a striking difference. The second big issue that I want to touch on that goes across the peninsula is the danger from the extremist Sunni groups. The two of most concerned are ISIL, ISIS, and AQAP, the Al-Qaeda I mentioned. The AQAP is effectively headquartered in Yemen, and it took the opportunity of the power vacuum when the Yemeni government collapsed, when the Houthis were taking, to re-equip themselves and to fund themselves. They are reported to have taken $100 million in US currency from the central bank, and have taken many of the arms that were provided by the Americans and Saudis to the Yemeni army for the purpose of fighting Al-Qaeda. And that the proliferation of arms in Yemen is one of the most distressing things about that country. In my view, AQAP poses a greater and more immediate threat to the stability of the peninsula and further afield. It has a modus operandi of exporting terror, and unlike ISIS, it does not seek to secure and build territory. It was AQAP who led the last publicly known assassination attempt on the Saudi royal family, when AQAP operatives detonated a bomb he was carrying when meeting with the now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Naif, who will now be known as MBN. That they were behind the attacks in Kenya. The Chicago shoe bomber was one of theirs. That they have two enemies: the near enemy, that's the Saudi royal family, and the far enemy, the West, and particularly the USA. The effective rearming and refinancing of al-Qaeda in the ungoverned spaces of Yemen poses, it's double the intensity of the threat. It's now, since the ceasefire has been declared, the UAE, the Saudis and the US have commenced operations against those groups. They've stopped on the Houthis and are going back after al-Qaeda. ISIS is quite distinct from AQAP. It has a different operating model and different objectives, and frighteningly, it uses the concept, the allure of unlimited extreme violence as a means of attracting and holding its supporters. It's notable, and I think Australians should be proud of it, that we were an early and significant participant in trying to degrade ISIS from bombing them in Iraq and Syria, from a base, as it happens, that's in the UAE, just outside Abu Dhabi. And progress has been made, not just through our efforts, but through a much bigger alliance against them. The recapture of towns in Iraq and Syria is demonstration of that progress. ISIS has ambitions to run a state which renders it a more definable target. It seeks to be self-funding, whereas AQAP relies on external funds. It's got a salary system. I went to a talk in Los Angeles earlier this year where they went through all the intelligence they had on the economic model that runs ISIL, whereas AQAP and all the Al-Qaeda affiliates are much more opportunistic. ISIS is probably doomed because it attracts, it's affixed itself to some notion of a bureaucracy. AQAP's reliance on external funds in a way made it more vulnerable because the world has become much better at stopping some of the illegal flow of funds, but robbing the bank in Yemen has given them an enormous shot in the arm. ISIS has any pro-Western Arab government in its sights, but also, and this is another distinction from AQAP, it has as one of its prime targets the Shia. The major direct impact of ISIS within the peninsula has been atrocities committed against Shia in the eastern province of Saudi and in Kuwait. Attempts to gain support from extreme Sunnis on the peninsula would seem to have been only modestly successful from ISIS's point of view. The fears that the UAE or Saudi would be squeamish about a Sunni on Sunni response do not seem to be well founded. The greater concern is a longer term one, that of returning ISIS jihadists. Not surprisingly, numbers of young men from the peninsula have enlisted in ISIS and are fighting in Iraq and Syria. Some of them will return and seek to execute atrocities at home. The demography of terror is such that under-engaged youth become inspired by the purposes they see in some of these causes, and sickeningly, the unlimited violence concept attracts them. Many of the countries in the region have very large underemployed youth. And most of the countries, and Saudi is one in particular, is the biggest user of Twitter and Facebook and other things I don't understand. The oil price is the third pan-peninsula issue I want to address. Oil is the greatest source of revenue for every country on the peninsula, with some considerable variations in the level of dependency, as you can see in the statistics that you'll get. The reactions of each of the countries from the fall from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel current price is $44, has been different and instructive. In the UAE, for example, it's placing higher taxes on expats than locals. In Saudi, an extraordinarily bold plan has been announced which will establish the sovereign wealth fund by putting its shares in Saudi Aramco, the national oil company, into its sovereign wealth fund and selling down 5% of Aramco. Aramco, on some valuations, is worth $1 trillion. It is the biggest and, I must say, the most successful, proficient, ethical national oil company in the world, and it can beat many of the other national oil companies in terms of its standing and quality. It's also got some pretty good resources. If the funding, the purpose of raising these funds is to diversify the kingdom away from oil by investing it in new businesses within the kingdom and businesses outside the kingdom. So, and Aramco just bought a whole swathe of refineries in the southern part of the US, which would be a kind of signal of the kind of things they want to do. Their mining company wants to expand outside Saudi Arabia. They would use the funds to do that. The alternative to this is that Saudi could just keep going as it is and spend its very considerable reserves. And it's probably got nearly $1 trillion in cash in one form or another around the world. And you could keep its current level of spending for 10 or 12 years and just hope the oil price went back again. And you could do a whole lot of things about cutting their projects. What they've done is said, we're going to keep funding all our projects, and there's some projects that are more rational than others. But they have decided that they will keep spending and they will restructure the economy. Now, I don't think it's possible for them to be as successful as they aspire to be, but it is my judgment that they will move it. There will be progress on this front, which makes it a really interesting place. One of the most pernicious things that the oil revenues have allowed is the country to have a dependency culture, where the preference of young Saudis is to be employed by the government, often in jobs that are not particularly productive, and as a result, many of the jobs which are regarded as having lesser social standing are filled by expats of one variety or another, either expert expats or others doing more menial work. The program of Saudiization is trying to enforce people to employ Saudis and to reduce the dependency on expat workers. This has been tried many times over the last 10 years, and I'm dubious of its capacity to be particularly successful in the near term. But the kingdom is hell-bent on changing it. The late king introduced a major program. He found the mullahs an obstacle to changing and improving the local education program. So he had bold ideas. He said, well, we'll get all the bright kids and we'll send them overseas, and they'll be trained in the best universities in the world. And so at one point, and I think it's still numbers, there are 100,000 Saudi kids in tertiary education institutions in the United States, paid for completely by the Saudi king. Now, that's an education system. Talk to Simon Birmingham about that one. And in Australia, and this may surprise some of you, there are 11,000 Saudi students in Australia at the moment. The Saudi government spends $500 million US a year in Australia on tertiary students. I think that's probably bigger than the education budget of some of our states. The program was an expensive way of trying to head off the kind of reform confrontation with the mullahs. Young Prince Mohammed bin Salman is actually keener on taking him on, particularly the need to educate women has been largely overlooked, and the first female universities are relatively recent. Other changes that have happened in Saudi as a result of the oil price fall are the creation of a new set of taxes to change behaviour. They've got a new value-added tax, a reduction in the subsidies of fuel and water, and this provides an interesting political problem. Those of an American bent will remember the term no taxation without representation. There is no model of representation in the kingdom. There is elected local government where taxes aren't determined, And there's central government and regional government. There's a Shura Council, which is an appointed advisory board, where the king nominates you. And so there's going to be a new social contract that will have to be forged for this to work, and I'm not clear how that will work. But the public health system is an essential element of the social contract. The public health system had failed the Saudi citizens, and the new king is determined to give it a very high priority, and he's appointed one of the most competent men in the kingdom, the CEO of Saudi Aramco, as the health minister. He's got two jobs, but the kind of intellectual core of Saudi administration is largely derived from the engineering culture of Aramco, and it's one of the finest, as I say, in the world. So I think it provides a backbone for many of the public services. The reform program is definitely changing things. The government's been restructured in a more coherent and effective way, with the intrusion of more technocrats and a reduction in the number of princes. And those princes who are still there are much more concentrated and fit for purpose in what they're doing. The Saudi use of energy has been profligate, to say the least. It burns nearly half of the oil it produces, which is staggering. For example, the Saudis like their dairy industry, and so they use desalinated water to water alfalfa farms to feed the cows. So if you looked at the real cost of a litre of milk in Saudi, I think it'd probably be the most expensive in the world by a multiple. Land banking by the princes and the merchant families has made housing shortages in Saudi. So you go to Riyadh, which is a very large city, and there are large slabs of open sand, and they'll be owned by some princes waiting for the land price to go up. And so they've now introduced what is called the white lands tax on vacant lots, and that will lead to more housing. So there's a very deliberate program to try and address the social ills, and there is, I believe, a very good chance that will hold the country together. Saudi has the third largest defence budget in the world, behind the US and China. It's decided, much like Australia, to build an indigenous defence industry capability as a way of getting some jobs in technical industries for the country. The challenges of these changes to the conservative fabric and vested interests within Saudi are significant. However, the threats from not doing so are greater, and I believe the business opportunities from the changes are considerable. The last Pan-Peninsula topic I want to address is Iran. As a result of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was the negotiations between the permanent 5 members of the UN plus Germany, the embargoes being lifted, and Iran, of course, is not Arab, but it is Muslim and Shia dominated. Much of the analysis on Iran discusses a Shia-Sunni divide, as if there's, and there is, a deep sectarian issue that poisons the relationship of Iran with most of the occupants of the peninsula. My view is it's slightly different. Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example, and certainly Oman, have had long and fruitful and very pragmatic relations, even since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, where Iran overthrew the Shah and became a true theocratic Shia state, led by the most prominent Shia clerics in the land. The conflict from the two countries is essentially one of regional dominance. The Saudis were particularly disturbed in the aftermath of the Second Gulf War, when Iraq was turned from an ostensibly Sunni country into a Shia country, and one where the government of Iran plays a strong and highly visible hand. The Iranians have been active and most effective people, have been the most active and effective people in fighting ISIL in Iraq. The current government of Iraq has been reined in by the Shia clerics, and we've seen this in the newspapers this week, for not being aggressively enough pro-Shia and anti-Sunni within Iraq. The Assad government is supported by Iran. The Russians only intervened, in my view, because the Iranians had run out of enough resources to keep the Assad government in power. The Saudi Arabian government has parted company with its long-term allies in Lebanon because they feel they have become too susceptible to Shia influence or to Iranian influence in the fact presented there by Hezbollah. It's perhaps the most overarching threat to the peace of the region, the Iran-Arab conflict. It's one that's having profound impact on the Arab countries who traditionally regarded the United States as a strong ally. President Obama, in the eyes of the leaders of Saudi Arabia, has made three significant errors. First, he didn't support President Mubarak in the Arab Spring. If he could leave behind an old friend of the United States, which ally was next? That was a concern for King Abdullah. Secondly, he failed to follow up when he drew a red line in Syria after the gas attacks of President Assad against his own population. Obama had said, "You've crossed the red line," and he didn't follow up. But worst of all, he conducted negotiations with Iranians that have led to the lifting of many trade and finance embargoes in return for the standstill on nuclear developments. This was done entirely against the wishes of the Saudis, although they didn't utter that too aggressively in public. And it's led to a most extraordinary phenomena, a close relationship between Saudi and Israel. I mean, it's very interesting. If we'd been having this conversation about the Arab Peninsula 10 years ago, I think we would have spent most of the time talking about Israel and the Palestinian issue. I'm only mentioning it because I'm not mentioning it. The Iranian threat is I think, to the Arabs, is much more economic than it is strategic. The Iranian population is by and large better educated than any of the other countries on the peninsula. Women are fully integrated into the workforce, and the country has never had the dependency mentality that grips most of the oil-rich countries of the peninsula. Without the restraints of the embargoes, it's entirely possible for Iran to grow at a rapid pace. And that's distressing to the Saudis. As anything Iran, and Iran has got a population that's twice the size of Saudis, and it currently has half the economic standing in terms of GDP, and it's got the same kind of demographic profile. It's got a young population. Lastly, I mentioned the US, and I'd just like to finish on this note. The US is possibly the only power with the capacity and influence and persuade Arab countries to find a pragmatic accommodation with the Iranians, and force the Iranians to drop some of their hostile and insurgent policies that they've had in the region. I'll come to Australia, sorry. But this comes at a time when the US is uncertain about its attitude to the region. It has an enormous force based in the region. I'm not sure of the numbers. You may know them, Mark. It would be over 100,000 US troops and sailors and airmen. It's got some of its largest naval base in Bahrain and air base in Qatar, and the fleets that are constantly in the Gulf and the Red Sea. It is proposed to the GCC, and President Obama has met with the GCC leaders a few weeks ago, that they fund a joint missile defence system over the Arab Peninsula to stop any incursions from Iran. Now that would help give the Arabs confidence to live in the same area as Iran, but they don't really have much choice. The Americans don't feel as dependent on the US for energy, and that's altered attitudes in Washington. I must say I'm very amused when I go to Saudi and people keep quizzing me. When I go to America and people quiz me on Saudi, they keep saying, "Tell us about the succession." And I said, "Well, tell us about yours." There's a danger that if the Americans do take the view that they're not as dependent for oil from the Gulf for their security, that would be a major error, because the world is dependent on it. The growth engines of China and India are totally dependent on it. I'd just like to finish, and I'm sorry I've gone on too long, on Australia and its relationship with the region. We currently have an embassy in Riyadh and an excellent ambassador, Ralph King, which also covers Yemen, Oman and Bahrain. We have one in Abu Dhabi, which covers Qatar. We're soon to open an embassy in Qatar, in Doha. We have a consulate in Dubai and an embassy in Kuwait. Most of Australia's economic engagement in the region has traditionally been the export of traded goods. Saudi Arabia, strangely enough, is the destination for Australia's largest manufactured export. And those are the Toyota Camrys from Melbourne, which are one of the most popular cars in Saudi Arabia. But when Toyota goes, that's the end of manufactured exports of that nature. We also have a long tradition of selling agricultural products, particularly dairy products, beef, wheat, controversially live sheep. And Australia's, of course, imported large quantities of oil. The UAE acts as a hub for the region. Goods are exported into UAE and then go on to Saudi and Kuwait. So if you look at the figures, you'll think that UAE is 10 times bigger than everything else, but it's a transit. Education is becoming an important industry. I mentioned the Saudi students that are here, and there are many other students from the UAE and Kuwait who are here. But there are quite a few Australian education institutions that have established themselves in the region. Additionally, I would argue that the Gulf is now Australia's most important air transport hub. It's difficult to make it to Europe without stopping off in Dubai. You've got to go to a lot of trouble to go otherwise. Dubai, Doha, or Abu Dhabi. Their vast investment in airport infrastructure means that this trend will continue. The levels of investment in Australian property and listed investments are hard to measure, but they are very considerable, and I see this anecdotally. My opposite number from the Saudi side, the Saudi Australian Business Council, came to Australia for the first time, went around Sydney and said, "I'd like to buy a house." And I said, "Well, I'm sure there'll be somebody who can oblige you." He said, and he spent south of 20 million, but north of 10 million, which I thought showed confidence. Etihad Stadium, the Emirates Melbourne Cup, are two local examples of the prevalence of our relationship. There are now I believe, over 140 flights direct from the Gulf to Australia every week, going into every major city in Australia. That fundamentally changes our relationship with that region. The government has discussed establishing a free trade agreement with the GCC, and I believe there's a little more hope for that recently, and establishing investment and double tax agreements. But let me finish with the last observation. The relative ease of dealing with the Emirates, Dubai, Kuwait, Bahrain, should not obscure Saudi Arabia from our vision and the scale of its opportunities. The similarity of our interests are well worth the attention it deserves. They want to have value-adding downstream businesses to a resource economy. They are dealing with a very dry continent. They are dealing with problems of urbanisation and many of sustainability issues that we confront. And Australia's long-term interests require us to diversify our trading and investment relationships. Currently, we have a greater exposure to China than any other country in the OECD. I believe greater attention to this region is one way, not the only way, of achieving a diversification. Thank you very much.